My name is Adam Smith. I'm a senior fellow here and head of the Center for Peace Operations. Very happy today to be joined by two leaders of civil society in South Sudan to talk about the crisis going on in South Sudan and the way forward. You may notice that the panel is a bit truncated. We originally started with a delegation of 4. Unfortunately, in the last few days, we've had some complications. We had a visa that was not issued, unfortunately, and we had an illness as well. So we have only 2 panelists, but they're very, very good ones and very compelling. And so I look forward to hearing what they have to say and to our interaction today. What I'll first do is maybe give a few words on the crisis and kind of where we stand now, for those of you who aren't fully up to speed, because there have been recent developments in the last few days. And then I'll hand it over to our panelists, who are, to my right, David Deng, Research Director of the South Sudan Law Society, and Aniyat Dawal, Founder and Director of the Roots Project, South Sudan, and also a member of the CPJ Secretariat. The CPJ is the Citizens for Peace and Justice, which is a network of civil society organizations in South Sudan. As you know, the crisis in South Sudan erupted on 15th of December. And speaking of crises, one averted. Thanks. Crisis erupted on 15th of December 2013. And there have been ongoing hostilities since then between those loyal to the South Sudanese President Salva Kiir and the opposition former Vice President Riek Machar. Just on Friday, there was an agreement signed by the two of them in Addis Ababa. The agreement contains a commitment to an immediate cessation of hostilities within 24 hours of the signing. We've heard that there were some hostilities over the weekend, but things are clear today. The two leaders have committed to freeze forces in their current locations and refrain from any provocative action or combat movement until a permanent ceasefire is agreed to. They've further committed to unconditionally cooperate with the full operationalization of the IGAD monitoring and verification mechanism, as well as to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to all populations affected by the conflict. In addition, they agreed to work together to move the country forward by establishing a transitional government of national unity through an all-inclusive peace process that will include the 2 direct negotiators, as well as the SPLM leaders, the political parties, civil society, and the faith-based leaders. The transitional government of national unity will be tasked to oversee government functions during a transitional period, implement critical reforms as negotiated through the peace process, oversee a permanent constitutional process, and guide the country to new elections. Just today, we heard that perhaps those presidential elections could be delayed to 2017, 2018. And the terms of the transitional government will be negotiated through the IGAD-led peace process. So that's the agreement that was agreed to on Friday. There had been a previous agreement, which both parties had apparently not lived up to. 2 days before the agreement, there was 2 human rights reports released, one by Amnesty and one by the Mission, which I think gives a sobering, adequate summary of some of the horrible conflict situations on the ground right now. To quote from the report, there are reasonable grounds to believe that gross violations of international human rights and humanitarian law have been committed by both parties to the conflict. Violations include extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, arbitrary arrests and detention, targeted attacks against civilians, and attacks on hospitals, as well as against UN facilities and the peacekeeping mission and its staff. In light of the widespread and systematic nature of many of these attacks, information suggesting a degree of coordination and planning in some incidents, there are reasonable grounds to believe that certain crimes against humanity may have been committed, including murder, rape, and other acts of sexual violence, enforced disappearance, and imprisonment. I encourage you to read the reports. As I said, it's a very sobering picture of the situation. Right now, in terms of the humanitarian situation, there are an estimated 1.3 million IDPs within the country, not including some 300,000 refugees that have spilled into neighboring states. And right now, the aid experts say that if the residents don't plant their crops by the end of May, mass hunger is likely to set in and possibly even famine. WFP says overall that 3.2 million people need food aid and that a hunger catastrophe will set in if food aid is not soon delivered. As you may know, the UN has a peacekeeping operation in South Sudan. It has since 2011, the UN mission for South Sudan. It has opened its bases, its compounds to civilians seeking protection and has taken in over 85,000 civilians. That has been a tremendous challenge for the mission and also for the humanitarian actors that they're coordinating with. I have a number of questions for our guests, but I should be quiet and let them talk, because that's what we're here to do, is listen to their perspectives on the situation. First, we'll start with Aniyat, and then we'll go to David. So please, Aniyat, thank you.
Is it working? Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity for civil society to be here and to let you all know exactly how the situation is affecting people in South Sudan and the different voices. Because what tends to happen is that the political leaders are the ones that basically explain the situation, and that's how the South Sudanese peace process, the South Sudanese, from independence, all the focus has always and often been on the political leaders and what it is that they're saying. Mainly because people in South Sudan are illiterate, because people are coming from war, people don't have access, but the people of South Sudan have a lot to say. It's very hard to know where to start. I have 10 minutes. I can talk probably for 24 hours. But perhaps just to set the context, I was in Juba, just visiting actually when this started, and the feeling that I got just being at home, stuck, with the shooting started. I mean, the first thing that we all thought was that this is not gonna last. This is just something that happens every Christmas. Soldiers get a little bit agitated. They haven't got paid. It's gonna blow over. It didn't. Waking up at 6 a.m. and hearing the artillery, more shots, gunfire, bombs, it was a real wake-up call. Everyone was planning on a Christmas. Everybody was planning on celebrating and just having a quiet time, but others had different plans. For me, it highlighted just how out of control the situation is. The people of South Sudan have no control over their environment. They have no control over the situation that happens around them, and this is something that has to change. So I wanted to touch on the feelings that are brewing with amongst the people in South Sudan. You have probably 3 different types of feelings. You have those of the Nuer community, the ones that are also the opposition, wanting the change that they want to change. Obviously, the killings that happen in Juba have been the start, but we have a very polarized community in South Sudan, and this is exactly what is driving the conflict right now. Unfortunately, because of the support, the unwavering support from one side or the other, the government side or the opposition side, people are willing to close their eyes to the reality, to the truth, to the fact that violence is affecting everybody, to the fact that both sides are committing gross atrocities and willing to just continue with the retaliation and the counter-retaliation. So this is something that has to be addressed and has to be looked at. The fact is that our polarized communities, this is all being driven by the leaders. They're supposed to lead the people so that we can all have a unified stance on what it is that we want in South Sudan. The third voice, or the third group, would be the people who are seeing the situation for what it is. supporting one side or the other, unfortunately, puts you in one camp or another, and it's not a solution. It's not a way forward, and that's what needs to be amplified, because we have to stop the retaliation, we have to stop the violence. That's the basis for which everything is going to be able to pan out. Civil society met first in January 2014, following the crisis, of course. And for us, it was very, very difficult dealing with the situation. We've all lost people. We've all known people who have lost as well. And how do we make our community again? How do we become one people? How do we move on from here? How do we resolve the situations that we have? So obviously for civil society, the first thing is stopping the violence. The second thing is the protection of the civilians, the humanitarian issues, the effects of the conflict, and then ensuring, of course, the humanitarian access so that people can survive this. And the fourth being complete reforms, institutional reforms, reconciliation, peace, unity. How are we going to achieve all that? So we came up with, we're trying to have an inclusive process where the voices of the people are being heard. So just to go back a little bit on the polarization issue, I think in general, whatever it is we're looking at in terms of policy development, in terms of how to solve the situation in South Sudan, we have to really think about the conditions that need to be apparent, that need to be there in order for whatever change that we're talking about, whatever wonderful reports and wonderful policy documents that we're writing, is it possible and is it feasible? In all the years that I've been working in South Sudan, we have seen all the problems, but we all ignored it because it was a beautiful story, because it was something that everybody wished for. But wishing it is just not enough. And right now, it's not fair. It's not fair for people who had all the wishes but are dead, who have lost, and who are homeless, and who don't trust their neighbors and their old friends, who are divided amongst families. I mean, we have to be completely and utterly honest. I guess a lot of things that I will say are probably my personal views. We haven't had a lot of opportunity as civil society, considering the last, the recent events, the signing of this agreement between Salva and Riek. But my personal view is that it is not possible to achieve the things that we want to achieve when the environment is not conducive. So whether we like it or not, we have to really think about that. And I really want to ask and plead that we look at the situation in that way. What kind of a country are we going to have, or what kind of a transitional period are we going to have with Salva Kiir and Riek Machar as the leaders again, considering people are very divided? And how are we going to stop those divisions? What kind of a country are we going to have if Salva Kiir was the one to win this war, if there's such a thing as winning this war? What kind of a community are we going to have if Riek Machar was to win this war? I think the message needs to come across from everywhere, and to also ask these leaders what they really think. How is it possible for either or both of them to be able to reconcile and and fix the rifts that have been created through this conflict? The polarization issue is a huge, huge problem, in my view. We cannot move ahead until that is dealt with. The hate that brewed, the killings that started, it just took days. It was a matter of hours and days for the whole country to be completely engulfed. The environment is totally different. It's like a completely new, different world, and that's basically the crux of the matter. And in terms of peace building, which is what I'm trying to work on, we have to be as multi-layered, multifaceted in the way that in the approaches that we take in sorting out the situation that has been created in a matter of months and weeks and days. Focusing again just on the political reconciliation and therefore it'll trickle down, it will not trickle down. The distrust is just too dangerous. The way I see it, I just don't see it lasting. If the elections are going to be postponed for the next, until 2018, I just cannot see the type of environment that people will be living in with the distrust between the two leaders, the distrust between the two parties, and the distrust between the people. How are we going to deal with that? So civil society is trying to come up with different ways of dealing with it. Reaching the people has been one of the hardest things. The situation obviously makes it even harder for civil society members to be talking to people, accessing IDPs and victims, and going to certain regions. How can we do that? How can we reach the people of South Sudan? How can we go down and just talk to them about the retaliation issue? How can we talk to them about how unwavered support from one side or the other, how is that going to bring the future? So that's the kind of support that civil society needs. Civil society needs creative people. Civil society needs creative support in order to do things and approach peace building in a way that the hate destroyed everything. We can't just do it in one way. We can't just do it with one group. It has to be broad-based. Women, children, youth, church, chiefs, everybody, from in every aspect, in all these different ways. So that's one of the things that we're doing. A project that what we are initiating is called Naming Those That We Have Lost. Basically to name the people killed since December 15th. Since 2005, there have been numerous conflicts, I'm sure most of you know about, of course, among Southern Sudanese communities. All those have been ignored. All those have been buried because of, for the sake of not rocking the boat, for the sake of keeping the peace. But, our boat has sunk. So there's no boat to be rocked, and we just have to deal with those things. So this naming project is an initiative to try and name all the people that have been killed from all communities, military, civilian, everybody, from all sides. The good thing right now, the positive thing is that a lot of communities are collecting names of people that have been killed. However, everyone is keeping their own list to themselves. And what that does is that you're looking at the list of people killed from your own community thinking that you're the only ones that lost. Everybody has lost. So that's another way of just breaking down the barriers so that people can understand that in order for us to find a future, we have to acknowledge each other's losses. We have to be able to feel the pain of somebody else, because currently that's what's driving the conflict. So we also need support within that project. We've had a lot of people a little bit lukewarm, saying that maybe it's not the time to do this. I don't understand what we would be waiting for. The time is now. It's always been now. So, so this is some of the initiatives that we're trying to work with. I also want to talk a little bit about women. I started an organization called the Roots Project. We work with women from different tribes, making traditional arts and crafts, just as a way to employ women, to have them there, having something to do, become economically sufficient, but also deal with a lot of problems. And that's where a lot of problems happen, of course. The way we deal with conflict when it happens and it arises within the organization is to actually look at, I mean, because people usually just end up supporting your own tribal member. But the issues are the same. Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants to live peacefully. Everybody wants to put their kids in school. Everybody wants to be able to access healthcare. But the tribalism comes in because they don't know how to deal with that. So, but women are amazing. Women are the future. Women are the ones that can actually break the barriers in South Sudan. The women of South Sudan in I think it was 1993, after the 1991 split, were the first ones that came and actually started the reconciliation within the party. Let's not underestimate the role of the women. Women are the only ones in South Sudan that I think, as a group, can actually break the cycle of violence. And so even if a peace agreement is brokered, even after all of that, we cannot ignore the women. They're the ones who take care of the children. They're the ones who bring up the children. They're the ones who work, and they're the ones who mend the family rifts. And they're the ones who see the bigger picture. They're the ones who look at the future and understand that this is not a way forward. But they're the weakest people in South Sudan, them and the children. So also in the current context, the women are the ones who quickly mobilized and went to Addis Ababa to try and have a voice over there. They need to be supported. It's a huge percentage that the women of South Sudan, and they're resilient and they're hardworking and they care. So the focus on women has to be very strong this time around. I think that I'm just going to leave it there. I hope that maybe you've been sort of thinking of, if you want me to dig a little bit deeper about any issue. I'm here to sort of answer whatever it is that whatever the questions are. But we have a very damaged and pained community. And we need to fix that, because until we fix that, we can't move ahead. And that's the support that we really need. Okay.
Thank you so much, Anith. What I heard was that we need an all-inclusive process to get past some of the polarization that's evident in the population. A real and honest look at the conditions on the ground. No more blinders. Look at the problems and not ignore them. Deal with them honestly as they are. We need a multifaceted approach to peace building that takes into account youth, elders, women, religious leaders, tribal elders. We also need to acknowledge the losses that everyone faces from each community, the losses that everyone has faced, and then also your project on women's economic empowerment, empowering women who are sometimes the ones that can actually bring together the communities. That was great, excellent. Thank you for your contribution. Next, we have David Deng, who hopefully will give us a bit of an insight as to what is civil society in the South Sudan context and how can they play a role moving forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great pleasure, honor to be here. I think NES presentation really impressed, at least upon me and hopefully upon you, the depth of the division that this conflict has put into society. You have friends who, over the course of just a matter of days have become enemies and don't speak to each other on the street. And even outside of the conflict zone, what it has done to society is really quite dramatic and unimaginable. I thought I'd give a bit more context, the sort of background of what is civil society, some characteristics, and then to discuss the issue of accountability a little bit. And we mentioned some of the, these are reports that came out recently which paint this very bleak picture of what's happening, and systematic use of rape and sexual violence as a tool of war, and very sort of the enormity of what's happening. So I want to discuss a bit about accountability and thinking about how that could be promoted in this context. So starting with civil society, it really grew out of the humanitarian effort in South Sudan. If you look back during the last civil war from '83 to 2005, civil society organizations grew up around efforts to deliver food aid, to provide services, the humanitarian element. To the extent that advocacy organizations existed, it was mainly to criticize Khartoum. So it's very much a safe environment for advocacy organizations, in the sense that there wasn't so much internal, introspection in terms of what was happening in South Sudan, but it was about criticizing Khartoum for the way that the war is being fought, etc. As we moved ahead until the early 2000s, the beginnings of this peace process that would eventually culminate in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which brought to an end that 22-year civil war, started coming together. This process was designed as an exclusive affair. So the SPLMA, the major rebel movement in the south, and the government of Sudan had decided that among themselves they would negotiate this peace. It didn't involve armed groups from elsewhere in the country. It didn't involve anyone outside of those two parties. Nonetheless, civil society and other groups were able to influence the content of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and actually make very instrumental contributions. The church was there very early. The church, of course, to the extent we're considering them as civil society, has a long history and has really developed a network and a system that's far ahead of NGOs and other civil society. So they played a key role at first in terms of getting the parties to talk to one another and setting the stage for this process. The diaspora, through academics in the diaspora, introduced this idea of one country, two systems, which formed the basis of the CPA, the idea that you would have one system in the north, one system in the south, but it would be in the context of one overall country. After a certain period, there would be a vote for self-determination. This was something which came from civil society in the diaspora. The organization that I work with, South Sudan Law Society, many of the lawyers who were not members of the armed movement made very sort of concrete contributions to the process. So there was some input. Then as we move forward, we come to 2005, the CPA is signed, the government of Southern Sudan is established with all these mechanisms under the CPA. This, for civil society, was the first sort of jolt. There were two main sort of impacts. One was a huge brain drain from civil society to the government. You have a new government, everyone wants to see it succeed, there's a lot of optimism. So all of these key leaders that we had in civil society assumed government positions, and we lost a tremendous amount of experience. But then also there's a recognition of a need to begin scrutinizing the conduct of South Sudanese a bit more. And this was another difficult transition, particularly for advocacy organizations, because it required maneuvering through the sort of political dynamics of South Sudan and dealing with issues that were a bit more contentious internally. At the same time, this period from 2005 until independence in 2011, there's also a growth that happened in civil society. Taking a step back and looking at society more generally, there's a clear growth. You have educational opportunities opening up, economies developing. There's sort of a development of society which happened very quickly. It was most dramatic in Juba, but you see glimmers of it elsewhere as well. And as society developed, that then presented opportunities for civil society more broadly. So if I give an example again from the legal profession, in 2007 there were 12 lawyers in all of South Sudan. So if you wanted to register a business, you had to go to one of these 12 lawyers. If you wanted to sell a car, you had to go to one of these 12 lawyers. And they were, that was what it was. Then, 5, 6 years later, we got to a point of maybe 150, 200. It was reaching a critical mass of lawyers where they really became a force that could do something. And in terms of that profession as a civil society entity that influences policy and decision making, the growth of society then translated into this growth of civil society, and similar things in other professions, the media profession, business community, all of these aspects grew until we got to December 15th. And I think in a very short period of time, all of the gains of that period were lost. We had seen a closing off of space for civil society. The more that they became critical of things in South Sudan, the less room that there was for them to speak publicly on matters of the public interest. That has come now to an all-time low because of what has happened. It's very difficult for anyone to have the types of open and frank discussions that are needed in order to address the real root causes of the problem. As Enya said, we need to focus on creating an environment in which all these wonderful things that we want to happen can happen, elections, constitutional reform, you name it. And a big part of that is being able to talk about the things that we need to talk about, which currently is very difficult. And one thing we're trying to think about is strategically, how do we open that space and how do we begin engaging with people and forcing the powers that be to give us the room to have these discussions. It's been, things are tough now. At the same time, I think there's opportunity and there's sort of some truth to the idea that circumstances, to the extent that civil society is able to rise to the challenge, that these circumstances could help to build skills and to set it on a trajectory that could lead to a much more robust, independent voices in society. To a large extent, I think this will hinge on the manner in which civil society relates to the peace process that's currently underway. And that will sort of set the trajectory for things moving past this conflict. So as Enya said, shortly after the conflict came out, different groups began meeting within just a few weeks afterwards. The organization that we've been involved with, Citizens for Peace and Justice, started in January, and others have been meeting. It's been a rather consistent message, the immediate concerns about stopping the violence, protecting civilians, etc., but then also acknowledging that there's a more deep fundamental governance crisis which has led us to this point. Granted, the trigger may have been this political dispute within the ruling party, but it never would have assumed the level of conflict that it's become, were there not these more fundamental problems. You look for the last 5 years, every year, the per capita income has been less than the previous year. There's people who had such high expectations of independence and are confronted with a situation in which there's no opportunity, there's nothing that they can do, particularly young people. And these are the same people who now have been recruited into the violence and have become the drivers of the conflict. And it's this underlying failure to deliver those public goods and services that states are supposed to deliver that really has set the stage for what we see. So there's a need to be more fundamental, but then, as was said, a need to be more inclusive. And here I think one needs to give credit to many of the institutions that are around this mediation peace process for emphasizing the issue of inclusivity. IGAD has had several extraordinary summits, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is regional body that's mediating the peace process. They've had a consistent stream of statements from the head of state level, highlighting the need for an inclusive process, saying that this can't be done the same way it was done in the past with the CPA. The only way to get a real sustainable peace that's owned by the people of South Sudan is to involve them in the process. The UN also has been very clear on the importance of inclusivity. Until now, it had been the parties who were the main stumbling blocks, but as was said in the introduction, in the most recent agreement from May 9th, they seem to have agreed to involve civil society, church groups, the former detainees, and other sort of key groups who don't have armed wings into the process. So there's an opportunity here. So on our part, we actually had a conference in March at the invitation of IGAD, in which we tabled a proposal for a modality by which civil society would be engaged. And it was comprised of a combination of people on the ground in Addis who would have various roles in terms of relating to the peace process, but perhaps more importantly is the coordination mechanism in South Sudan, in that the really only relevance of civil society's participation is the extent to which they can reflect the interests of the people in the process, and also to channel information back to populations in South Sudan. So that's really been the focus of our efforts. We've made an official request for accreditation, and we're hopeful that it will be approved, and we'll, continue to pursue this line. But things are still at a very early stage, so we'll have to see exactly how it pans out. So moving on to the issue of accountability, I think the civil society is clearly a key stakeholder in terms of getting this onto the agenda. If it's left to the parties themselves, they will grant each other amnesties, they'll shake hands, they'll go to Khartoum and begin divvying up the oil revenue among themselves. So unless there's an independent voice there to really force the issue of accountability, nothing will happen. In terms of the rationale for it, I think a lot of us see it as actually a fundamental cause of the conflict, the culture of impunity, the failure to treat accountability both in the context of peace agreements, as well as a more general inability to hold people accountable for their actions, really across the board. So if one looks, I already mentioned how the CPA really was silent on the issue of accountability. That was replicated in every peace process that happened since. There have been, probably 10 or more rebellions before this most recent one, all of which the approach was to grant amnesties to the people who were responsible, to give them military and political positions sort of as incentives to get them into the process and to try to absorb them into the military. And this has backfired in that it's become a path to power, is to take up the gun. And if you can create enough of a disturbance, then you're rewarded for it. And I think most people now have reached a point where this is accepted as a given, that the culture of impunity is really what has gotten us here, and it needs to be addressed. Whether or not that's going to be done is a more difficult question. Then also the calculation that it does for individuals. Shortly after the killings happened in Juba, where elements of the SPLA, killed hundreds of civilians in the space of a few days, the message went very quickly to people in their home areas, who then responded by finding the closest member of the tribe, which they thought was responsible, and killing that person. And this concept of revenge as being sort of a preventative measure, both retribution for what was happening, but then also preventative in the sense that people feel if they inflict enough harm on another group, then the other group will be less likely to attack them. And this arises in conditions where there are no justice options, where the state doesn't provide people with a neutral and sort of independent means of accessing justice. So their only option is to take matters into their own hands. So, it's an issue that one can look at in many ways, but the lack of accountability has been a tremendously destabilizing factor for South Sudan. To the extent that one can accept that this culture of impunity is a problem, the next question is how do you address it and what do you do about it? And I think there's a couple things that I'd like to highlight in terms of thinking through what are the objectives of an accountability mechanism, or what are we going to do? I think the first thing is to acknowledge that the justice system in South Sudan is completely unable to deal with this situation. Even commonplace crimes, they have a tremendous amount of difficulty with, much less violence on the scale of what we've seen. So necessarily there has to be a certain international component to any accountability mechanism. And I think that's where the discussion should start, rather than saying there should be time for something to be done in South Sudan. And, we've seen time and time again for the last 10 years, it's not going to happen. So there needs to be an international component. Another question for ourselves is what is it specifically that we're trying to do? And I think here thinking short-term and long-term is important. So clearly we want to provide remedies to survivors. We want to punish the perpetrators and to disincentivize this conduct. But if there's also an opportunity for longer-term reform and for transformation of the justice system, or at least getting that process initiated, it might be worth thinking through to what extent is that possible. And I think this question tells us something about where justice must be served. We could have 2 or 3 people prosecuted in The Hague at the ICC, but that would do very little to spur improvements in South Sudan. I mean, it may be one part of a solution further down the line if it turns out that nothing's going to happen in the country or in the region. But for the moment, I think the best case scenario is if we can get something in South Sudan moving in order to have this sort of legacy which can be left over in the country. I think it's also important to be realistic about what this specific criminal prosecution of individuals who bear the most responsibility for war crimes, crimes against humanity, that type of initiative, what exactly is it achieving? I would argue that the broader goals of deterrence and retribution, which are often sort of ascribed to criminal justice interventions, that maybe is not the most direct benefit of this sort of prosecution of, the dozen or so people who bear most responsibility. Rather, I would see it as an opportunity for the government to demonstrate its commitment to fighting this culture of impunity, towards building a culture of respect for human rights. So it's not so much trying to reach everyone who's done something, who's violated these norms, but rather is an opportunity for the government to sort of send a message to its people that this is something it takes very seriously and that it will commit its time and resources to. There's also a question of scope. I think there's a instinctive desire to want to be comprehensive and to deal with crimes even going back to ones that happened during the last war or, you name it. In terms of manageability and what's feasible, though, one would probably have to distinguish between things since December 15th, those that happened earlier, thinking about how an intervention to address these very serious crimes would relate to other initiatives, whether it's justice sector reform more broadly, prosecutions within the formal system, reparation schemes, truth commissions, this sort of comprehensive transitional justice initiative, and thinking through that ahead of time. How can you design complementary initiatives from the outset so they don't come into conflict with one another? And then lastly is the need to do it to whatever intervention is proposed to meet certain standards, fair trial rights, due process, that kind of thing. We need prisons to put people. You can't put anyone in a prison in South Sudan. They're decades away from meeting international standards. Rwanda solved this question by building their own prison and making sure it met international standards so that they could receive people who had been convicted of genocide. And is that possible in South Sudan, or can we send people to Rwanda? I don't know. There are questions there that would have to be sorted out. So one mechanism, I hope I'm doing okay on time. Okay. One mechanism that's been getting a lot of attention is the idea of a hybrid court or special court, mixed chambers. It has different names. But the idea of sort of a joint international, national effort. The idea first actually came from South Sudanese civil society, which was good. It shows that there's a degree of interest and acceptance of that idea, and I think politically it will make it easier to argue for it. It was then taken up most recently by the UN in this human rights report, which came out recently, which makes a very clear recommendation for a hybrid tribunal as a preferred mechanism for dealing with these disputes. We're also hopeful that it sounds as though the African Union Commission of Inquiry, which is currently looking into this matter, headed by former President Obasanjo of Nigeria, we're getting indications that they're also receptive to this idea of the hybrid court. So we see a sort of building momentum around this, which is encouraging. I think just to sort of bring everyone up to speed, there are basically 4 factors that characterize a hybrid court. The first is that it applies both domestic and international law. So you're able to prosecute the crimes against humanity, the war crimes, these crimes under international human rights and humanitarian law, as well as crimes under the national jurisdiction, murder, sexual offenses, that kind of thing. It has a combination of international and domestic personnel, lawyers, judges, investigators. So the idea is that there's a skills transfer, that the international participation can help it to meet certain minimum standards and to deliver in terms of what's required of justice, but that the national participation keeps a sense of ownership over it within the state and contributes to that legacy, which we discussed earlier. Then formal international participation. So previous examples often done with the UN. Special Court in Sierra Leone is a classic example. Also elsewhere, Bosnia-Herzegovina, East Timor, there's often a formal agreement whereby the international intergovernmental organization participates. The AU recently made its first hybrid tribunal in Senegal to try the former Chadian dictator Hassan Abre. So there's also some sort of current attractiveness to the idea. And then finally, the tribunal would be in or near the conflict-affected state. So again, that local ownership. So I think it's clear how this sort of meets many of the goals that we're laying out in terms of contributing to reforms, doing something within the country, also the very practical problems that ICC politically is facing in this part of the world makes it sort of a preferable option. However, there's still a tremendous amount that needs to be thought about exactly how it would be done. I think it can be divided broadly into technical design questions. What aspects of the mandate of a hybrid court would be put in a peace agreement, and what would be left off for national legislation or constitutional amendment, that kind of thing. Ultimately, these things can't be done on the basis of peace agreement alone, and you need some cooperation from the host government. Legislation needs to be passed, and there needs to be a buy-in from the local government. And that's often actually where these processes fail. For example, in Kenya, there was a provision for mixed chambers to address crimes relating to the post-election violence. But when it came time to pass the legislation, Parliament said, we don't want to do it. And so that's why the case was eventually referred to the ICC. So one needs to think through the politics of it in that sense. How do we maximize local ownership? How do we promote the legacy question? So, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, they created a war crimes unit within the judiciary, which was a hybrid, involved international and national staff. But the idea is that over time, they would phase out the international participation and the institution would remain, which I think helps to generate that local ownership and the legacy of the initiative. Also a real question of whether the judiciary in South Sudan has even the minimum capacity that's needed in order to deliver in such a tribunal. And I think here there's a need to do some sort of assessment into the capacity of the judiciary, get human rights expert or human resources experts to really understand exactly what are we dealing with and how would one proceed. And then the whole idea of complementary initiatives. How do we deal with the informal system, the customary system, which provides the vast majority of justice services in South Sudan? They estimate 90% of disputes, criminal and civil, are handled in the customary system. How would this type of intervention relate to that? Even if it's not sort of a formal relationship, one still needs to think about in the broader reform agenda, how do we manage that? Then there's the whole issue of politics and how does one achieve this given the characters involved and the different scenarios that are likely to unfold. As I said, the individuals involved are very unlikely to willingly waltz into a situation, especially when there's such extensive crimes committed and anything that could come back to the leadership, they'll be very wary of. So there's a real sort of need to strategize about politically how one could pull it off. And I think a good first step is engaging people in South Sudan in the discussion and getting perspectives on where things are. And also thinking about this peace process in Addis and how do we get movement on that front, the Commission of Inquiry, how do we get them to consider these ideas in a bit more robust sense, the way they do their investigations rather, how do they develop a body of evidence which will be useful in terms of criminal prosecutions further down the line. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to be going into this, but the signs are encouraging. So I think I'll stop there and yeah.
Thanks, David. Very, very helpful. Outlined a number of challenges to ending the culture of impunity in South Sudan and some of the very technical and political questions involved with moving forward with reconciliation and with accountability. Thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do now is open it up to questions for our two panelists here. I have a few myself which I might add on to, but if anyone has questions now, please raise your hand, grab the mic, and we can go back. I see up the front here first, and then you.
Thank you. Mikiko Sawanishi, UN Democracy Fund, UNDEF. I think Agnes mentioned importance of inclusiveness, at the same time avoiding polarization. But if society is really based on the tribe and everybody has their own interest, and if it's really include everybody, it's hard to avoid polarization. And I think you mentioned also women's initiative. It's a really good initiative because it's really inclusive and also avoiding polarization. But I just really want to know if any other initiative can be done by civil society organization. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we'll take a couple questions. I'd seen this next. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mohamed Yahya from UNDP. My question relates to what the panelists think in terms of what the UN role could be moving forward. And the second relates to also the regional actors. What do you think the regional actors could do better, and what are the opportunities for regional civil society action? And finally, you talked about the issue of customary justice system. Will it not be more difficult? In Rwanda, the Gacaca process worked precisely because society is more homogeneous than South Sudan is. And we found that in many places, the challenges are that there may be different customs of justice. Have you any thoughts on that? Would be very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks. Take one more question over here to the side, to the left.
I'm Karen Colvard from the Harry Guggenheim Foundation. I have two questions. One, what's happening at the University of Juba? And are university professors and students involved in your peace projects? And do you see that as a fruitful source of further civil activism? The second is about communication. I understand that South Sudan is a big country with not very many good roads or easy ways to get around. How does civil society, how does it and how do you plan to communicate across the whole country? Radio is one thing that comes to mind, but I'd like to know if there are others.
Great. Thank you very much for those questions. There's a lot of questions, so I won't add anything to it, but maybe to second the question from our UNDP colleague about the role of the UN. I think this community and specifically is interested in the part the UN can play moving forward, the peacekeeping mission there, also the humanitarian actors. If you could have a comment on the role that the mission has played up to now, the helpful role, the unhelpful role, its priorities, and then also its priorities moving forward. What would be the most helpful in terms of your work for them to focus on moving forward? Thanks. We will start with Ania, please.
Okay, you asked about the inclusiveness and how to avoid polarization. The interesting thing about this conflict is that everybody is really kind of saying the same thing. The government supporters are saying we are democratically elected, We, however, see that there is a problem, obviously, because there's a war. We need to have reforms. We need to have peace. We need to have unity. We need to have no corruption. We need to have all these things, all these wonderful, wonderful things. The same with the opposition. The opposition is talking about democratic reform. This is the reason that they are fighting. It's for democratic reform, for unity, for peace, for institutional reform, everything. The same thing. Civil society is also saying the same thing. We want peace, we want unity, we want reforms, we want this, we want that. The international community is coming with the same message. Where is the peace? Where is the unity? How can we do all this? So now our problem just remains the means. And what is it that really is dividing the people of South Sudan? And I think the first and foremost is creating those conditions in which we can actually do this. So how do we do that? How do we do that? I think the conversation needs to be started. I think that it's not helpful for us to believe just blindly that the peace that was signed is going to bring us the peace that we want, because it's already happened. We cannot just sit here and just want to believe. We have to actually see it. And it's not possible in the way, the direction that we're going. As I mentioned before, everybody came together. Many people looked inside. The experts on South Sudan looked at themselves. We've been in South Sudan for 20 years. We believed in this country, and we're completely confused. South Sudanese, same thing. Civil society, same thing. People working in the government, people working everywhere. Everybody is confused. How could this happen? But the fact of the matter is because we all just allowed it to happen. We all closed our eyes to the things that were all wrong, and we used excuse after excuse after excuse. The main excuse being that we're coming out of conflict. If we're coming out of conflict, how can conflict resolve that? You know, and that's what we have to be honest about. In terms of the leadership, in terms of the excuses coming back and forth, I think it's time that people start to point out. If you're democratically elected, does not mean you can do anything and everything that you want. That is not what democracy is. If you want to be the president, then there has to be a process in which that happens. But even in achieving or claiming to achieve the things that the two sides are saying that they want to achieve, how is it possible? How can they unite people when people are so divided? And that just goes towards everything, even the accountability issue. For one side, justice is the other side going to jail. For the other side, justice is for this side going to jail. How are we going to actually achieve peace and unity and lasting peace, lasting and just peace? How are we going to get accountability if the two leaders are going to be in an interim government with sharing power? Is that really going to give us space to be able to investigate the crimes committed by the two sides? I don't think so. Is it going to give us political space for this golden leader to emerge? I don't think so. I think I like to emphasize on the people. The people have been always the ones just left. We're doing everything on the behalf of people, but we're not talking to the people. We're not engaging the people, and we're not including the people. One of the most important things in terms of inclusivity, everybody has to be included. That's without a question. We have a problem with information. Those on one side only get the information that they need to get in order to continue fighting. Same with the other side. How are we going to get information down to the ground? So that relates also to the communication issue. The hate, the violence, the information that basically spread the violence was spread through text messages or phone calls and all that. So we have to counter it in the same ways. People are in touch. We just have to be creative. It's not a press statement. It's not, the things that people are very used to doing. It's not analysis of this situation and that situation. It's getting to the people, and everybody knows what they want. And it's not that people are oblivious to the actual driving force behind the politicians. They know. But what is the solution? And for them, how do they survive this? So I think trying to sort out the communication issues, dealing with, radio. I mean, the phones has been, it's been terrible. In certain areas, governors have, switched off the phones because they didn't want people spreading the hate. But then again, how do you call for help? How do you let people know, your family know what's happening to you? So there's too much government control, there's tapping of phones, there's all these things. How do we deal with all that? The radios as well. A group goes in, they take over the radio. We had in one of our civil society conferences, we had some media people that came, and they were telling us that if the government comes, you have to call the opposition the rebels. And when when the city's taken over by the rebels, you have to call the rebels the interim government. So it's just, and it's days back and forth and back and forth how you send that message. So those who are actually starting this violence and actually driving it are controlling information. So information is very, very important. Black and white. This is what happened. This is the result. And this is who did it. I think people will begin to see that there is no future in this. And the role of the UN, I worked for UNMISS with one S for 2 years at two different times, in 2005, 2006, and then 2008, 2009. And I think the UN has had a lot of responsibility. The UN has also basically added to the situation. There was too much focus on the government, too much focus on the politics, too much focus on that, and no focus on the people. Again, as a civil society member, you go and ask for funding, you go and ask for support, it is not available. It is not available, and all the focus was up there. So, how much power do we have? How much influence do we have? The focus was all wrong, and all that did was just make them more and more powerful, because how is it possible that a small dispute within a room can lead to a civil war that has destroyed the lives of everybody? It's not possible. It's only possible if we all put too much power in the hands of just a few people. And that should never have happened. And we should make sure that it doesn't happen ever again. And we should make sure that moving forward in the transitional arrangements that we ensure that does not happen. And create that environment so that other things can happen. Customary law issues. I forget what the question was exactly.
Customary system, how does it relate to
being
forward in justice?
I think I'll leave that for David. I'll leave it for David. Just
the University of Juba.
University of Juba. I think I'll leave that to you as well. Inclusive process. Anyway, maybe we can talk more about the UN role moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I would just add a few points about the UN question, since I think that's probably what most people are interested about. There's been a lot of great stuff coming out, particularly from the level of New York, Geneva. The Secretary General was clearly just there recently, and there's been a lot of interest. The right messages are coming out about inclusivity and the need for accountability. I think that stuff is great and needs to continue, hopefully. Also, support that's given to different processes. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been given support to the Commission of Inquiry, this AU Commission of Inquiry, that probably needs to be further strengthened. and maybe formalized in some way. Also, investigations that were recently announced in Bentiu and Bor with these recent massacres which happened in both locations. The EU is launching investigations into that, and we're hopeful that it will compile useful information and make it public. So there's quite a lot of good happening. Where I might have more critiques is with respect to the field mission of UNMISS. One is their mandate and the extent to which they focus on the state building element of the mandate. And there's concern that that's inconsistent with the human rights due diligence policy, and that by giving support capacity building to police and other actors within the state, that you're necessarily supporting their criminal activity. So there's serious inconsistencies there, and I think that's on everyone's radar. And we're hoping that it will be addressed in the new mandate renewal, which will happen in the near future. Then more specifically on the human rights issue, the need for regular reporting. So this recent report which they issued was great, and we all read it, and we're happy that it was done. But before this, they've sat on many other reports because of fears of the political fallout of it. We've consistently said there's a need for more regular reporting. They shouldn't be doing these one-off reports. They have dozens of human rights monitors in the country. There's no reason why they shouldn't have regular human rights updates and a much more robust reporting system. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. With respect to the regional actors and regional civil society, it's actually been a huge asset for us, working with other civil society organizations in neighboring countries, and also the African institutions that are set up to be forums for civil society engagement. So Kenyan civil society in particular, the initiative that we're a part of, Citizens for Peace and Justice, is inspired somehow by Kenyan initiatives, Kenyans for Peace, Truth, and Justice, KPTJ, which did a lot of work around the post-election violence. And they've been a huge resource for us in terms of deciding how to deal with a polarized group. And they were confronted with a very similar set of conditions to what we have. We went recently to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. They put out a resolution on South Sudan, in part because of the advocacy that we did there. We were there most recently encouraging them to play a much more robust engagement role with the government, to push the government to ratify the core human rights treaties, which they haven't done. It's the only African country which hasn't ratified the African Charter. So working on that level as well with the AU and IGAD. The Human Rights Council, we went to the session in March. We'll be going again in June. There have been calls for a special session to address South Sudan. So I think some of these initiatives are where we can work with our civil society partners, whether regionally or internationally. What we're doing now, with Crisis Action and other NGOs, I think this type of thing is hugely important to reach the sort of nerve centers of decision making. The University of Juba question, there's actually been a lot of happening there. Actually, CPJ in our meetings have had several professors from University of Juba as part of it. Actually, there were professors from different universities. And then we were surprised during our March conference in Addis, we had several sort of key professors who have been real resources for us. They were appointed to positions in government universities while they were there in Addis as part of our event. And the president decided that, that there's a new vice chancellor at the University of Juba, John Akech, who has been involved with our meetings since the beginning. What was behind it? I don't know. It was an attempt to co-opt people. I think the result is that now we have sympathetic voices in key decision-making places within academic institutions who we continue to rely on. So there's a huge opportunity there. Also, the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Juba University has been instrumental in providing space for the types of discussions. The university is an environment where you can have the academic freedom to a certain extent to talk about things. And there's a recent event sponsored by Justice Africa in Juba where we were discussing about issues of reconciliation and justice, and it was co-hosted by Center for Peace and Justice Studies. And it was really one of the first times that people were able to talk in a candid way about some of these issues. So I think they will be a key sort of part of civil society in terms of moving forward. On the customary justice question, I don't know that I have any sort of great answer. As I said, it's a hugely important service provider. It's also deeply flawed in that it reinforces a lot of the discriminatory and abusive norms that are there in our society. I think one real asset is its ability to function efficiently and its resilience in conflict. I can give you an example. When I was in Jonglei State before all this happened during their last conflict, and I was in Akobo, and this was a time when there was a lot of insecurity in the county, and all of the chiefs who were holding customary courts in the rural areas had relocated to the county center, and we're still hearing cases there in the county center. They basically just picked up and were sitting under trees, and people were traveling from there to come and handle their adultery case, or if there's a marriage dispute, or whatever the sort of run-of-the-mill disputes that continue even in the midst of conflict. The customary courts were able to keep addressing those, and then once the conflict subsided, they just picked up and went back to their home areas. And you can never conceive of a formal justice system being able to do that. As soon as there's a whiff of conflict, the formal justice system basically shuts down. So I think there's a real sort of, they've evolved along with the context, and I think developed tools that they can use to sort of address the needs of the people. But, they can't deal with conflict on this scale. It's a huge gap in their skill set. And they have very serious problems in terms of institutionally how they're set up. So I don't know that I would say that there are any magic bullet that can help to resolve the issue. But one does want to keep them in mind in terms of developing different sorts of interventions and thinking about what role they would play in a post-conflict South Sudan.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions if they're out there. Yeah, I see on the left hand up here first. We have
It's Rhonda Haubin, and I have a blog at Die Tageszeitung at the tats.de website. And my question is that in January, the Jordanian ambassador brought up the issue of reconciliation at the UN Security Council. And at the time, he said there was a real weakness in the UN dealing with reconciliation and understanding how to peacefully deal with conflict and mechanisms of really taking on reconciliation. And I'm wondering if you feel that is a weakness at the UN, and if there's some way that learning from the prior people who've done reconciliation, if the UN took on to somehow build its strength on this, if that might be helpful. And there was a meeting on January 29th at the Security Council, and what was interesting, there were many countries there, and it showed that there was very little understanding of reconciliation among them. And so the result of it was the Security Council did nothing as a result of that effort. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Let's see. I think I saw over here, and then all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Leeson from the International Rescue Committee. And I was just wondering, in terms of how you describe civil society being so focused in the past on humanitarian work and then with a move to government positions, what role do you see with international organizations to complement the work of local civil society? What can we do to help what you're doing in your work to reinforce whatever it is that you're doing, and but then also considering that a lot of the organizations are much more humanitarian organizations as opposed to advocacy organizations, maybe you don't even see a role. So just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think we had two in the back row.
Thank you very much. I'm Helena Grunberg with the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And I wanted to maybe pick your brain a little bit. You had mentioned the importance of women and women's role in the peace process moving forward. And you also mentioned that women are the only one who can end the cycle of violence, and the support needs to be given to women. But can you elaborate a little bit on what kind of support? We work a lot with women's organizations on the ground, and we're doing what we can to support. But are you talking about financial support? Are you talking about capacity building? Are you talking about advocacy here at international level for the inclusion of women? Just to give us some recommendations that we can work with here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. And let's see our final question in the very back left.
My name is Gay Dwayne. I'm from South Sudan, and I'm a citizen of that country that been going through rough time. Thank you so much, David and Anyeth, for shedding lights on these problems. To tell you guys a little bit just about me as a Southern Sudanese and how I'm being affected too by the civil war. I was among the kids that really left the country in 1983. And then we came to Ethiopia by foot, and then we're known all around the world as the Lost Boy of Sudan. That's the name that was given to us. So what happened in December 15th was very sad. So I lost a lot of family members. Up to right now, having tracked them down. I'm from Jonglei. Most of my family live in Jonglei and Unity State and Malakal. And David, you have a good idea, because when I go to Juba, I stay with David and we eat together. And we both from different ethnic groups, which is I'm Nuer and they both Dinka. And when I come, I'm being invited by my sister Anyeth, and we do a lot of things together. But what happened in our country, I think, is the leadership that really split us apart. So what I wanted to ask is that if you guys can elaborate a little bit, because I heard there's a lot of cluster bomb being used by Uganda that been participating in the country directly and militarily. What can the human rights do about that? Yeah, and the current killing too that happened in Boortown, and my family lived there. Some of them, they die, and they are the people that have been there for the past 5 months. And some of my family lived too in Unity State. And when the Unity State was attacked by the rebel, a lot of people say that many innocent people are targeted and they are killed based on their ethnics. But my question is that if the war broke out in December 15th and all the citizens was evacuated, because most of my family been living in the bushes there in Unity State, who are the people that really live there? Is the place invited to the Darfurian people who are fighting the North Sudan? Because they say they're the one who got targeted, and those people are really military that participated. What can the human rights do too about that? So those are my questions.
Okay, thanks for those questions. I'll turn it back to our panelists to address any of these questions that you want to address, and then for any kind of final comments. So maybe we'll start with David and then end with Anyeth. Please.
I think I'll start with a question about international organizations. We had a great initial response upon our first coming together. The first time when Citizens for Peace and Justice came together, it's actually before we existed. It was in early January, and it was an event that was sponsored by USAID through ACOM, and they brought a group of about 20 civil society leaders and a bunch of international key resource people, including several donors. And there was a really great commitment on the part of the donors to provide us with the support that we need to move ahead and to sort of leave us with the room to develop our own objectives and our own priorities. And it was a really nurturing sort of relationship. And I think that's hugely important. And to the extent we've continued to make relationships with key donors that we know will give us the space to sort of move in the direction that we feel we need to move in. But of course, it's not all about any one organization. There's a need, I think, to support civil society in many different ways. through direct support capacity building. A lot of people are interested in the ADIS component of everything because I think that's maybe a bit more glitzy. But even the real people-to-people work in South Sudan is where the initiative will succeed or fail. And to really establish ourselves and to be able to demonstrate that we're talking with people and we know what they want. And I don't think we're at that point yet where as civil society collectively, we can say that we really are representing the people confidently and prove it to people. But we have plans for how to get there. And I think that's sort of real important part. I mean, in the past, many of the examples of coalition building in South Sudan have not fared well. I think in part because international organizations came with their own idea of what needed to happen, and that sort of skewed things a bit. So maybe to learn from these past efforts and to think about how support can be given in a way that it enables civil society rather than, dividing them. Just on the issue of reconciliation, I don't know that I have a direct answer to your point, but one of the real success stories of reconciliation in South Sudan was the people-to-people peace process in the wake of the split in the 90s that Anieth referred to earlier, where people came together and it was something that was really supported by the church, but came as an initiative from the communities that were affected, and they came together and met and talked and came out with this, it was called the One Lit Peace Process, and they came out with a very sort of comprehensive set of things that needed to be done, and it played a real sort of key time in terms of reconciling the movement and overcoming many of these splits. Then it was tried to be replicated, and it was something that was taken up by international organizations, and it was taken. This process took many years to come, and it was very much a homegrown initiative. But they wanted to package it and have it be done in 3 months, and have their set of criteria by which the success would be measured, and externally funded and driven. And they haven't been able to really. The success has been more mixed in subsequent efforts. But there is a lot to build on, and also within the customary systems, the nature of talking things out and reconciliation is one of the strengths of the customary system. There are mechanisms that have existed to manage disputes among groups and across communities. At times, they're more successful than others, but there's something there that I think could be built upon. Then finally, on the issue, the question of the UPDF came up, and I think the whole regionalization of the conflict. You mentioned the evidence of use of cluster bombs, and I think this is something that's been documented. We're still waiting to see the official investigation reports, and I think the UN probably has information about this that they're not sharing with us. But it's hugely concerning. But also just the way that this conflict has rapidly gone and sucked in groups from other parts of the country. We have Jem from Darfur, who's very openly fighting alongside government troops. SPLMN also there have been rumors about them being involved in different battles. We've heard of John Jaweed fighting on the side of the opposition, and perhaps even support being given by the government of Sudan to the opposition, maybe playing both sides. This makes, of course, Ethiopia very concerned. Eritrea is channeling weapons into the conflict. So I think the longer that this situation continues, the more it will become a war economy that certain actors will come to benefit from. So there's a need to really get a handle on that. And I think Uganda's role has been particularly damaging in that respect, that they went in really fast. Whether there is a need to or not, I guess, is a question, and a legitimate question. In that, if the government of South Sudan lost 60 or 70% of its military overnight, and was faced in a situation where the opposition was really poised to take Juba for a time. So I don't know, but the manner in which it's been done has not helped, and it's really compromised IGAD's role as well. This is a body that's meant to be the neutral mediator, but it has an armed force on the ground. So I think finding some resolution for that and a more neutral force which can act as a buffer between the sides and really enforce the ceasefire, I think is really the direction it needs to head. But yeah, it's a hugely concerning part of all this.
Thanks, David. Anif, please. Final words.
Yeah, Gare, just to answer your questions on the role of human rights. I mean, it's very hard for civil society to get involved in human rights investigations at the moment. It's a very dangerous situation, although it's been in our plans to do that. And that's also perhaps something that people working for, international organizations or even the UN can help us with, which is access and, the ability even to go into the UNMISS camps to be able to interview people, to be able to do peace building, to be able to do a whole range of things that, we should do. I should not be denied going into the camp. The reality is it'll be risky for me to go into certain camps, but that's not a reality we should accept. So how do we break that down so that we don't continue this? And the fact of the matter, Gir, is that the war just has to end. It serves no purpose. It has no purpose. And it will just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And that's just the fact of the matter, that it just has to end. Nobody has control otherwise, even the people who are fighting it. So that's how we see it. I mean, the first thing is stopping the war. The question of reconciliation, again, related to the camps in the UN. I mean, obviously, this is the best thing that the UN has done. Saved hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese people, of civilians. This is just, it's, if the UN wasn't there, it's unimaginable what would have been. But how do we get people out? How do we change the situation so it's safe for people to come out? How do we break down all, So I think the weakness of the UN at the moment is like a complete focus on the humanitarian issues. The humanitarian issues are very important. There are people who are on the brink of famine, that 70% of the population. This is something that has to happen now. We need the support. We need the funds so that, people can, the war to stop, people plant, and then hopefully we will not be dealing with a looming famine for people who had no control over the situation, So I really do hope that we're able to, that the money will be available from the donors to be able to help the South Sudanese people have a chance, have another second chance in order to try again. But the humanitarian situation is not the thing that is fueling the violence. The hate is. So I would wish that UNMISS would have a more proactive role in trying to instill some peace building within the camps, breaking the groups up, talking about the pain, healing sessions, just whatever it is that people need in order to cope with the reality that they're faced with. We have to break that down. We just have to do it. The women's support issue, I think it came from the back there. Women need all kinds of support. Everything you mentioned, definitely. The financial support, of course. When I first started the Roots, I started with women making beads. They make the beads. We pay them the money. Eventually, what happened is women who had never dealt with money, obviously many things happened. There was alcoholism. There was, the husbands who were demanding more and more money. There was increase a little bit in domestic violence because, maybe a little bit of pressure and things like that. Other things happen. The fact of the matter is like, we don't have one solution. We don't have one intervention. We don't have one thing that we just need to do, and we do one thing, it leads to something else. The fact is, we are a damaged society and we have a lot of issues. But it's very possible because in 3 years, from the women that I'm working with, we have moved from, a huge number, big percentage of women dealing with domestic violence to becoming more stable. They even have a lot of respect for their husbands. The fact is, everybody is suffering one way or another. Everybody knows why people commit violence. It's because of something that's happened to them as well. It's just an outlet. How do we change that? We need to change the outlet of this negative energy, and it has to be sustainable. And when I first started the Roots, I had zero confidence with the women. They had zero confidence in me because they thought it was just an initiative, and as soon as it got hard and complicated, it'll be done. But it's just continuing and showing that you care. It's just the basic things. It's what you want. It's what I want. It's what anybody else wants. It's the simple things. But how do we get there? So the support for women should be actually looking at the issues that they have to deal with every day. Because even providing a space, a safe space, they come to work, how are they going to get there? What are they going to eat? What about who's going to take care of their children? That's the reality. We have 25% affirmative action in South Sudan, but can the women go to work? And it's not enough just to write it down. It's not enough to have a law. It's enough to help them actually get there. And when you find a barrier, try and deal with it. That's what the women of South Sudan need, because they can do it, and it will not take long. That is what I guarantee, because for the Roots, it didn't. It's just a matter of 1 or 2 years of just consistent love, care, just everything. You all know, everybody knows. Everybody knows what they need. That's what they need. I think that would be other civil society initiatives. Another initiative, well, I guess it's just actually working on different levels. One of the things that we really want to start doing is also working with the diaspora, our people abroad, because they have a lot of influence and everybody ignores it, whether it's positive influence, whether it's negative influence. There has been a lot of negative influence, unfortunately. And again, also spreading of the information that's convenient for the picture that one wants to paint. Why? If we look at the future, that's not the future. So we have to get to a place where we can all work together and just to actually create the conditions at home so that people can go back. That's the reality. So one of the initiatives that we wanna start is actually starting a dialogue with the diaspora and having a proper connection back home, and starting the healing. People are very hurt. So I just wish for. I think there's someone who mentioned something about.
Just 1 more minute.
1 more minute, yeah. We have to be very creative in how we deal with things. I hope and pray that we do not do the same thing in the same way, expecting the result to be different. Please, please, please. So many people are gone forever, So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. I want to thank Crisis Action, the organization that helped bring this delegation to New York, and they'll be in New York and then also in DC for discussions the next week. I want to thank our very, very brave and eloquent panelists, Aniyat Dawal and David Dang. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.